Welcome to Simply Stories, where real power hides in silence and truth always finds its voice. If you love stories where justice catches everyone off guard, make sure to subscribe, because this one will leave you speechless. The restaurant buzzed with life waiters, weaving between tables. The sound of wine glasses clinking against polished marble, and the soft hum of conversations that belonged to people who thought themselves important. From the outside it looked flawless. But what no one realized that night was that among the regulars and the affluent diners sat a man whose presence wasn't announced, whose status wasn't reflected in the simplicity of his clothes or the calm way he observed the room. He was the CEO of the very chain they were dining in, sitting alone in a corner booth, a black cap pulled low over his brow, a leather jacket masking the tailored suit he'd left at home. He hadn't come to dine. He came for the truth. He had received anonymous emails over the past few months, whispers about one specific branch. Something about toxic leadership, favoritism, even racially motivated mistreatment. He wanted to believe it wasn't true, but the pattern was clear. Employee turnover had doubled. Guest satisfaction scores were dipping, but only here. Then send HR or call in an audit? He decided to do something no one expected. Show up himself. Quietly, unannounced. He scanned the room like a silent camera. One thing stood out almost immediately. The staff didn't move equally. Some glided, laughing with the managers, being greeted with high fives and inside jokes. Others were like shadow silent, focused, isolated. One of them was a black waitress moving with swift precision from table to table. She wasn't smiling. For fun, only for service. Her tray never tilted, her steps never stumbled. Her posture was graceful but guarded. She didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then her answers were crisp and professional. And he noticed how she was treated. She was rerouted from larger tables, often interrupted mid-service, corrected for things that didn't seem wrong. Then he saw the manager loud, boastful, always finding a reason to linger around the tables handled by his favorites. He barely acknowledged the others, especially the waitress who now approached the CEO's table. Her eyes held the kind of strength that came from swallowing daily offenses. She offered a warm but distant greeting, introduced herself, and took his order with effortless courtesy. He asked for the ribeye, medium rare, and a glass of red. She didn't miss a beat, but her eyes flickered with something. Recognition? Caution? He couldn't be sure. The next few minutes passed in smooth efficiency. The bread arrived, then the wine. When she returned with the plate, she adjusted the silverware, placed the steak down with practiced grace, and then, with the subtlest motion, she tucked a small, folded note under the corner of the napkin. He blinked. It was done so quickly, so silently, that if he hadn't been watching her closely, he would have missed it. She didn't linger, didn't make eye contact. She simply straightened up and walked away as if nothing had happened. His heart picked up. Wasn't often. He was caught off guard, but something about that moment rattled him. Was she on to him? Or was this a message for someone else? He waited a few moments, pretending to adjust his fork, then casually slid the napkin aside and palmed the note into his hand. It was folded twice. Ordinary receipt paper, nothing elegant. He opened it beneath the table, careful not to draw attention. And there it was, written in neat, steady handwriting that didn't shake. Asterisk. Asterisk, if you're who I think you are, please don't ignore the truth. They're destroying this place from within. Asterisk, asterisk, no name, no plea. Just a statement, a warning. Truth wrapped in courage, his breath caught. He looked up, eyes scanning the room again, but everything moved as it had before. Laughter from the favored staff, the manager slapping the back of another waiter, the kitchen doors swinging open, releasing a burst of heat, and somewhere in the far corner, the black waitress refilling water glasses for a table that didn't notice her. He folded the note carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. He hadn't planned to act tonight. This was supposed to be the first step: observe, collect, report. But now, the entire nature of his visit had shifted. Someone in this place had recognized him beneath the layers. Someone had risked their job, maybe more, to make sure he saw what others wanted to hide. He took a slow sip of his wine, watching everything with new eyes. Every unfair interaction stood out more clearly now. He saw how certain tables were strategically reassigned, how this waitress was always given the corner booths with the least traffic, how her efforts were overlooked even as she worked twice as hard, and worst of all, he saw how invisible she was to the very leadership that should have been protecting her. This wasn't just favoritism, it was decay. And someone, brave and quiet, had just handed him the key to exposing it. He finished his meal slowly, tipping well, not because of protocol, but because he understood now. He gave no sign that he had read the note. He smiled politely, thanked her for the service, and walked out into the night, the paper still burning in his pocket. He came here expecting rumors. What he found instead was the first ember of a fire that couldn't be ignored. The note sat heavy in his jacket pocket, but its words echoed louder in his mind than any sound in the restaurant. If you're who I think you are, please don't ignore the truth. You're destroying this place from within. It wasn't just a message, it was a crack in the surface, peeling back the polished image of a thriving establishment to reveal something rotting underneath. As he sat there, still dressed as a casual diner, his eyes sharpened. Every laugh, every shift in body language, every glance between employees began to carry a different weight. The atmosphere hadn't changed, but his understanding of it had. Across the room, the shift supervisor leaned against the bar, talking too loudly, throwing around jokes meant for only a select few. The favored staff laughed on cue. It wasn't camaraderie, it was control, the kind that excludes with a smile. Meanwhile, others were left out quietly cleaning, running orders, disappearing into the background, and there she was again. Waitress, who had slipped him the note, moved silently through her duties, her face unreadable. Not a flicker of acknowledgement passed between them. She was either the best actress he'd ever seen, or she had long learned how to bury emotion deep enough that even truth couldn't find it. He stayed for dessert, pretending to browse the menu, giving himself more time to watch. The dessert was standard: a slice of chocolate, mousse cake, and a decaf coffee. But it wasn't about the food. It was about the energy shifting as the dinner rush settled. With fewer customers to distract them, staff interaction became more visible. The supervisor barked instructions to one of the younger male workers, who responded with hurried obedience. Moments later, the same worker was reprimanded for a dish being late, one he'd never handled. The actual delay had come from a favorite, who had been chatting at the counter, unaware or uncaring of the ripple effect. The favoritism was blatant, but no one spoke up, not even the victim. Silence had clearly been trained into them. The CEO took another slow sip of coffee and pulled out his phone under the table. He opened the most recent online reviews for this location. The patterns were there, subtle but consistent mentions of rude service, long waits, incorrect orders. But the common theme was inconsistency. Some guests praised the restaurant while others were scathing. The truth hid between the lines. Guests served by the favored staff left satisfied. Others had wildly different experiences. No one had connected the dots before, but he could see it now. It went deeper than guest complaints. It was a culture problem. Voices rose from the kitchen, not a scream, but sharp and biting. He couldn't hear the exact words, but tone alone told the story. Anger, blame, frustration that had nowhere to go but sideways. The swing door flapped once, twice, revealing a glimpse of the young male worker again, his jaw tight, eyes down. He was absorbing heat for something he hadn't done. Everyone knew it. The CEO leaned back, his appetite gone. He wasn't angry, not yet. He was disappointed. Not just in the people managing this location, but in himself. He'd built this brand on values, on people-first principles. But somehow, this pocket of corruption had been allowed to fester under his watch. The signs had been there, buried beneath operational reports and polished presentation decks. But nothing was more honest than what he was witnessing now. His waitress returned, clearing the empty plate without a word. Her hands were steady. Her eyes remained distant. Not once did she glance at his pocket or search his expression for a reaction. She had said her piece. And now she had placed her fate, perhaps her job, to the hands of someone she wasn't even sure would listen. That kind of courage didn't come from desperation. came from purpose. He placed the check on the table. Tipping generously was more than a gesture, it was quiet gratitude. She thanked him, voice still professional, then turned to assist another table. No moment of connection, no subtle farewell, just the rhythm of someone used to being overlooked, even while standing in plain sight. As he stepped out into the cool night air, the sounds of the restaurant faded behind him. But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was filled with that single sentence, looping over and over. They're destroying this place from within. It wasn't just about one manager or a few lazy staff. It was about the trust that had been broken, the values that had been replaced with fear, favoritism, and silent suffering. And it wasn't just affecting employees. It was beginning to reach the customers too. He walked down the sidewalk slowly, his hands in his pockets, the city humming quietly around him. Neon lights from nearby shops flickered in his peripheral vision. Horns honked in the distance. But all he could think about was that note. That folded piece of receipt paper had carried more weight than any formal report, any quarterly analysis, because it was written by someone who believed the place could still be saved. Someone who hadn't given up completely. By the time he reached his car, he wasn't just concerned, he was resolved. He had seen enough for one night, but this wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun. He slipped into the driver's seat, closed the door, and stared at the steering wheel. The face he'd worn tonight, the laid-back customer, the silent observer, that mask was starting to crack, not because of what he saw, but because of what someone had dared to show him. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, the CEO stood in front of the restaurant once more, but this time, he wasn't dressed like a customer. Plain black polo, a wrinkled apron, non-slip shoes, and a NAMA tag that read Devon. He had used an agency to get in quietly, requesting. A trainee slot through a back-channel contact who owed him a favor. No flags were raised. It's just another warm body to help during a staffing gap. No one suspected a thing. Not the shift supervisor, not the waitstaff. Certainly not the black waitress who had left him speechless the night before. He was no longer. Observing from the safety of a table he was in it now, sleeves rolled, hands ready. Walking straight into the belly of everything he needed to see, the day started with chaos disguised as routine. The favorites lounged near the hostess stand, chatting and laughing while others scrambled to prep the floor. The manager barely glanced at him when assigning stations, but his tone changed when talking to staff depending on their skin. Tone jokes to some, cold orders to others. The pattern was undeniable. When a black busser asked a question, the manager replied with visible annoyance. When a Latina server pointed out a mistake in a table assignment, she was brushed off entirely. But when one of his chosen servers cracked a joke, he laughed like it was the best punchline he'd ever heard. It was favoritism, yes. But deeper than that, it was bias hiding behind forced smiles and selective praise. As the CEO moved through the shift, the black waitress took him under her wing without hesitation. She didn't treat him as disposable or temporary. She trained him with patience and precision, showing him how to balance trays, handle the POS system, and navigate tricky customer requests. Her tone never shifted based on who she was talking to, gave everyone the same respect, even those who didn't return it. There was no hint that she recognized him, no sign that she was holding back. If anything, she seemed more focused on getting through the day than remembering faces. Her work ethic was steel, and yet quiet sadness lingered behind her professionalism like a shadow that refused to leave. During a short lull, they both stepped outside near the back entrance to catch their breath. She leaned against the brick wall, eyes scanning the ground, her voice low. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, not looking at him. "About the note. I shouldn't have dragged you into it. I didn't know what else to do anymore." The CEO kept his voice even, nodding as if he were just another curious new hire. She went on, her words tumbling out like they'd been held back for too long. "This place, it used to be solid. We had a good team, fair management. People wanted to be here. But ever since the new supervisor came in, it's changed. Plays favorites, punishes people for things they didn't do, mocks anyone who speaks up. And if you push back, you're suddenly not on the schedule. or written up for something petty. I've seen good people pushed out because they asked for fairness. She paused, then added with a sad smile, I only stayed because my little sister's medical bills don't pay themselves. I can't afford to start over right now. The CEO said nothing at first. He just listened, really listened. Every word confirmed what he had begun to suspect and went even deeper. It wasn't just a matter of mismanagement, it was fear. A carefully maintained environment where injustice was normalized and silence was survival. She wasn't the only one who had noticed, but she was one of the last who still cared enough to speak. The others had been driven out or broken down. Inside, service picked back up. A black couple came in and asked for a table near the window. The manager raised an eyebrow, muttered something under his breath, and gave them a table near the kitchen instead. When they politely asked to be moved, he made a snide remark about people always wanting special treatment. Ow. The CEO clenched his jaw, but said nothing, not yet. Every moment was a piece of the puzzle he needed. A puzzle no one else had ever bothered to finish. Later, another server, one of the manager's favorites, messed up an order completely, delivering seafood to a guest with a clear allergy warning. Instead of being disciplined, she was consoled with jokes and reassurances. Minutes later, a junior staff member was scolded in front of everyone for a minor clock-in error. The double standards weren't even subtle anymore. They were accepted. Expected. And no one dared to call them out. By the time the shift ended, the CEO's arms ached from carrying trays. But the weight on his shoulders came from something deeper. He had walked into this restaurant thinking he might find some unprofessional behavior, maybe even a leadership gap. What he found instead was a poisoned workplace held together by fear, exploitation, and survival instincts. He returned to his car long after dark, flipping through the small notepad he'd carried in his apron pocket. Every note he had scribbled now formed a clear map of dysfunction. That night, he sat at his desk in a modest hotel room, typing until his fingers cramped. He logged everything: specific incidents, names, times, quotes. He documented how the shift schedule excluded certain people, how jokes crossed lines into harassment, how disciplinary actions were weaponized against those who didn't fit into the inner circle, and how one person, just one, had risked everything to shine a light on it all. The truth was uglier than he had expected, but it was no longer hearsay, no longer anonymous. It was alive, pulsing through every corner of that restaurant like a quiet disease. But now he had proof. Now he had motive. And now he had a responsibility he couldn't walk away from. A week later, the staff were told to report to the dining room before opening hours for a mandatory meeting. No explanation was given, only that attendance was non-negotiable. The air was tense, thick with confusion and quiet speculation. Some whispered about a corporate inspection, others wondered if layoffs were coming. The manager sat at the front, arms crossed, pretending to look calm but shifting in his seat with every passing second. The waitress who had once slipped a folded note to a stranger stood at the back, hands clasped, silent. She kept her eyes low, unsure why her chest felt so tight. No one knew what was about to happen, and then the door opened. He entered not in his trainee apron or plain clothes, but in a dark, sharply pressed business suit, with polished shoes and eyes that held every ounce of authority he had once hidden. A hush fell instantly over the room. No one moved. Recognition rippled through the crowd like a lightning bolt. Few gasped. Some straightened up, suddenly on edge. The manager stood abruptly, his confident smirk flickering like a dying bulb. Several of the favorites paled, shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. It was as if the walls themselves leaned in to listen. The CEO walked to the front without a word, set a leather-bound folder on the table, and looked around the room. His voice was calm, but carried the weight of finality. First he said, "I want to thank everyone here who shows up, works hard, and treats others with respect, especially when no one's watching." A pause followed. "But that's not why I'm here." He opened the folder slowly and began reading, not from a script, but from the raw, detailed notes he'd written himself. Page by page, moment by moment, he exposed what he had witnessed. During his undercover shifts, the bias, the ridicule, the preferential treatment, He spoke of the jokes made about guests of color, of the busser who was spoken down to, of the disciplinary threats used as weapons. He quoted conversations word for word. He described how certain employees were left to carry the weight, while others were rewarded for doing half the work. It was not a speech, it was a surgical dismantling of a broken system. Every word landed like a stone. The manager tried to speak, tried to laugh it off, shift the blame, deny the details, but the CEO didn't let him. He cut him off mid-sentence, raising a hand without raising his voice. "You made these comments on Tuesday morning at 9:27 a.m. You said, they always want the window seat, don't they?" When assigning a table to a black couple, the room went still. You allowed a server to nearly cause an allergic reaction and then mocked another for clocking in late by 2 minutes. His eyes met the manager's directly. "I saw. I was there." The manager sat down slowly, visibly shaken, his voice gone. The room had turned cold, and then the CEO turned toward the back of the room, his voice gentler now. "There was one person," he said, "who did something that very few people have the courage to do. She risked her job, her security, and her silence to speak up not for herself, but for everyone else." His eyes found the waitress, the one who had slipped him a note without ever knowing what it might cost her. She stood frozen, unable to speak, her eyes already filling with tears. "Come here," he said. She stepped forward slowly, unsure if her legs would carry her. She had imagined 1,000 outcomes for the note she'd written, but this was not one of them. He reached into the folder and held up the folded piece of paper she had once slipped under a napkin. "Oh, you wrote this," he said, "and it changed everything. Thank you for your bravery, for your honesty, and for refusing to let this place lose its soul." She couldn't respond. Her mouth trembled, but no words came out. She stood in front of the staff she had worked beside for months, some of whom had ignored her. Others who had mocked her hand for the first time. They saw her, not just as a quiet server, but as the one who'd spoken when no one else dared. The meeting didn't end there. The CEO continued. HR representatives entered the room shortly after and began distributing sealed packets, official notices, reassignment memos, and in some cases, termination letters. The toxic staff members were removed. An internal investigation was launched. Immediately, new policies were announced: strict anti-bias training, anonymous reporting systems, and rotating leadership oversight to prevent favoritism from taking root again. Those who had been overlooked received quiet apologies, promotions, and compensation reviews. Back pay was arranged for missed shifts, unfair deductions, and wrongful write-ups. It wasn't fanfare. It was correction. Quiet, dignified, and overdue. As the staff dispersed, shaken but hopeful, the CEO took a moment to personally speak to several of the workers he had observed: the young busser, the dish crew, the hosts who had been brushed aside. And then, finally, he turned back to the woman who had sparked it all. "I want to offer you a new position," he said, handing her a sealed envelope. "Not here, at the corporate level. We need voices like yours helping shape the culture everywhere. If you'll accept it, I'd be honored to have you rebuild what others tried to destroy."
Oh.
She opened the envelope with trembling fingers and stared at the offer letter inside. God, it wasn't just a promotion. It was a new chapter. A chance to make change, not just for herself, but for all those still stuck in silence. That evening, as the restaurant buzzed with a strange new energy, relief, fear, and maybe a little hope, she packed up her few belongings. Her locker, once filled with resignation and quiet despair, now held nothing but possibility. She took a final look around the room, unsure if she'd ever return. And then she saw it. Taped inside the locker door was a simple note on plain white paper. "Thank you for saving the soul of this place." No name, no signature, just the truth. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself smile.